Racist man demands black passenger be removed, regrets it instantly when he sees the FBI badge. He thought he could bully a black man out of first class with nothing but a carefully crafted sneer until his victim calmly reached into his pocket and flashed his FBI badge. Charles Wentworth III, a man whose tailored suit reeked of old money and entitlement, sauntered through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, his custom leather briefcase swinging with practiced nonchalance. He'd flown this route, Dallas to Washington D.C., countless times. The first class was not merely a preference, it was his due. He expected, nay, demanded comfort, exclusivity, and the quiet hum of fellow elites. So, when he approached his row and saw a black man in a sharply pressed navy blue suit already seated beside him, a vein pulsed visibly in Charles's temple. The man exuded a quiet power, a self-assuredness that Charles found deeply unsettling. He sat with his laptop open, eyes intensely scanning the screen, fingers flying across the keyboard like a concert pianist. Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The first class wasn't supposed to be integrated. He set his briefcase down with a thud, a microaggression barely masking his simmering displeasure, and slid into his seat. Marcus Briggs, the man beside him, barely registered Charles's arrival. He remained engrossed, his dark skin catching the cool glow of the laptop screen, highlighting the keen intelligence in his eyes. He moved with an effortless grace, a palpable aura of belonging that seemed to mock Charles's preconceived notions. Charles, however, refused to be placated. He inhaled sharply, a theatrical sigh designed to penetrate Marcus's focus, and shifted in his seat, subtly bumping Marcus's armrest. No reaction. He sat up straighter, eyes darting around, searching for a flight attendant, a silent plea for someone to rectify this inconvenience. Finally, he leaned in, invading Marcus's personal space with the audacity of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending politeness that barely concealed the venom beneath. "Are you certain you're in the right seat?" Marcus didn't even glance up. "Yes." The single word, delivered with quiet authority, was a slap in the face. No elaboration, no explanation, no deference. Charles's face flushed. He cleared his throat, his gaze snagging on Lauren Mitchell, a young flight attendant in her early 30s, who had been attending to passengers a few rows ahead. Charles subtly beckoned her over with a flick of his wrist, as if summoning a servant. Lauren approached with her usual professional smile. "Is everything all right, sir?" Charles forced a mirthless chuckle, shaking his head as if bemused by the sheer absurdity of the situation. "I think there's been a little mix-up. I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Lauren glanced at Marcus, who finally paused his typing and looked up. His expression was an unreadable mask, but there was a glint of steel in his eyes, a silent challenge that made Charles's stomach clench. Lauren consulted her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Mr. Briggs is in his correct seat," she said politely, her gaze firm. "Your ticket says 2A, and he's in 2B. Charles blinked, his grip tightening on the armrest. "That's odd," he said, forcing a dismissive laugh. "Are you sure?" Well, I just assumed." Lauren's smile remained plastered on, but a flicker of weariness crossed her features. She'd seen this dance before. "I'm sure, sir. Everything looks correct." Charles's carefully constructed facade cracked for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it over with a tight-lipped smile. "Well," he exhaled, the word laced with disdain. "I suppose mistakes happen." He turned towards the window, but his mind was a churning vortex of resentment. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus, meanwhile, had already returned to his work, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard a deliberate act of defiance. Lauren hesitated, sensing the palpable tension radiating from Charles, then gave Marcus a subtle nod of acknowledgement before retreating. Charles, however, was stewing. His fingers drummed a restless tattoo against his knee, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Marcus wasn't reacting, wasn't offering explanations or reassurances, wasn't playing the subservient role Charles had subconsciously expected. And that, more than anything, fueled his rage. Charles Wentworth III was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Charles sat rigidly, arms crossed, his mind a battlefield of indignation. He had flown first class for decades, and never, not once, had he been subjected to such an unpleasant situation. The man beside him wasn't overtly offensive, and wasn't breaking any rules, but that was irrelevant. He simply didn't belong. Charles's breath grew ragged, his simmering irritation reaching a boiling point. He couldn't passively accept this affront. He jabbed the call button, the soft chime echoing through the cabin like a summons to battle. Lauren Mitchell reappeared moments later, her smile still in place, but the warmth had noticeably diminished. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" Charles kept his voice low, his tone deceptively reasonable. "I'd like to request a seat change." Lauren blinked, her professional facade momentarily faltering. "Oh? Are you uncomfortable? Is there an issue with the seat itself?" Charles hesitated, caught between his ingrained prejudice and the need for a plausible excuse. He couldn't voice his true feelings, not outright. Instead, he subtly inclined his head towards Marcus, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I don't feel comfortable sitting here," he said, his words dripping with insinuation. Lauren's smile wavered. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. If there's a technical issue with the seat, I'd be happy to." "No, it's not the seat," Charles interrupted, his patience fraying. "It's—" He exhaled sharply, letting the unspoken words hang heavy in the air. "I just prefer to sit elsewhere." Lauren glanced at Marcus, who had once again paused his typing, but remained silent. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. He was a predator waiting to strike. "Let me check if there are any open seats," Lauren said, tapping furiously on her tablet, desperate to defuse the situation. "Just a moment." Charles sat back, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Marcus didn't react. He didn't argue, didn't acknowledge Charles's presence, didn't offer any explanation for why Charles might be uncomfortable. And that only intensified the older man's simmering rage. A few rows ahead, a man in a blazer craned his neck, pretending to check his phone, but eavesdropping. Across the aisle, a woman nudged her husband, her eyes wide with morbid curiosity. People were noticing. Charles's discomfort grew. Lauren's fingers moved with increasing speed over the screen. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity today, sir," she announced, her voice laced with forced apology. "There aren't any open first-class seats available." Charles's stomach clenched. Lauren smiled apologetically. "Would you like me to check in the economy? There might be a seat available there." Charles's face burned. "Economy? As if he would ever." He sputtered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. That's not going to work." Lauren's smile remained fixed, unwavering. "In that case, I hope you don't mind staying in your assigned seat." Charles forced a thin-lipped smile. "I suppose I have no choice." Lauren nodded briskly. "Let me know if you need anything else." She turned and walked away, but Charles barely registered her departure. His ears were ringing with the injustice of it all. Marcus, still silent, turned back to his laptop and resumed typing, effectively dismissing Charles as if he were a bothersome insect. This wasn't over. He jabbed the call button again, his frustration reaching a fever pitch. This time, Lauren hesitated before returning, her shoulders slumped slightly. "Sir?" Charles sat up straighter, his eyes blazing. "I need to speak to someone in charge." Lauren's face remained impassive, but her patience was visibly fraying. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. Is there something I can clarify for you?" Charles's voice sharpened, laced with a dangerous edge. "I need to speak to the head crew member or the pilot." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone let out a nervous cough. Lauren's expression remained professional, but her patience was wearing thin. "Sir, the pilot is preparing for takeoff and won't be available. But I'm happy to assist you." Charles pursed his lips, his jaw working. Marcus wasn't reacting. He wasn't nervous, wasn't shifting in discomfort. It was as if he had faced this kind of prejudice before, and was utterly unfazed. Charles lowered his voice again, his words coated in a venomous sweetness. "I don't feel safe." That changed everything. Lauren's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard professionalism. Marcus stopped typing, his entire body tensing. Across the aisle, the middle-aged man wearing a Bluetooth earpiece muttered, "Here we go again." Lauren straightened up, her voice dangerously calm. "I'm sorry, sir, but can you clarify what you mean?" Charles folded his hands neatly in his lap, tilting his head slightly, projecting an air of injured innocence. "I just don't feel comfortable. He hesitated, drawing out the silence, letting the unspoken accusations fester. "I don't want to be difficult, but I think it would be best if someone else took this seat." Marcus closed his laptop, his movements deliberate and precise. He looked Charles directly in the eye, and for the first time, Charles felt a tremor of doubt, a prickle of unease. Charles wasn't backing down. He was escalating, his voice rising to a fever pitch. A hush descended over the cabin, the weight of Charles's words pressing down like a suffocating blanket. "I don't feel safe." The phrase, dripping with insinuation, hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a shout, but it didn't need to be. It was carefully chosen, and designed to elicit a specific response. Lauren, still standing beside him, remained motionless, her posture rigid, her eyes darting to Marcus, who had fully closed his laptop, his hands resting on top. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, he simply stared at Charles, analyzing him with unnerving intensity. Charles refused to flinch. "Not yet." Lauren exhaled slowly, her voice low and measured. "Sir?" she said carefully. "Are you saying you feel threatened?" Charles tilted his head slightly, offering the barest hint of a shrug. "I'm not saying that. I just don't feel comfortable. That's all." Across the aisle, the businessman with the Bluetooth scoffed, muttering, "Unbelievable." A young woman 3 rows back subtly raised her phone, pretending to text, but recording. Other passengers whispered amongst themselves, their heads swiveling between Charles and Marcus. Charles registered the shift in the atmosphere. The tide was turning against him, but he wouldn't be deterred. "This is a simple request," he continued, feigning politeness. "I'm just asking to be accommodated. If I'm uncomfortable, I should have the right to move seats, shouldn't I?" Lauren's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "Sir, I already checked, and there are no open first-class seats available." Charles pressed his lips together, his face flushed with mounting frustration. "And coach?" Lauren hesitated, her gaze hardening. "There are 2 open seats in economy." Charles straightened a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Perfect. He can take one of them." A low rumble of disapproval spread through the cabin. Marcus inhaled deeply, his fingers drumming once on the surface of his laptop before going still. He didn't argue, didn't object, but he also didn't move. Lauren blinked, as if struggling to comprehend Charles's audacity. "Sir?" Her voice was lower now, firmer, laced with a barely contained fury. "Just to clarify, you want me to move this passenger to economy because you don't want to sit next to him?" Charles nodded once, his face a mask of self-righteous indignation. "Yes." Lauren inhaled sharply through her nose, her body radiating suppressed anger. "That won't be happening." Charles's eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me?" Lauren folded her hands in front of her, her voice unwavering, her gaze laser-focused. "Mr. Briggs has a first-class ticket, just like you. He is in his assigned seat. I cannot and will not ask him to move." Charles's face flushed crimson. He was losing control of the situation. Passengers were staring openly now, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disgust. The young woman with the phone continued recording, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Charles felt a cold dread creeping into his heart. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "I am simply asking for the same courtesy that would be extended to anyone else who feels uncomfortable." Lauren didn't budge, her expression unyielding. "You are asking me to remove a paying passenger from his assigned first-class seat and relocate him to the economy for no valid reason. That is not an accommodation. That is discrimination." A sharp silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the hum of the plane's engines. Someone let out a low whistle, a collective gasp of shock and condemnation. Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. He simply watched Charles, waiting for him to unravel. Charles's pulse throbbed in his ears, his chest tightening with a suffocating wave of panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Lauren squared her shoulders, her voice gaining a steely edge. "Sir, we are about to taxi. If you cannot remain seated and follow flight crew instructions, I will have to ask you to deplane." Charles's stomach plummeted. "What?" Lauren's tone remained professional, but her gaze was unwavering. "You have 2 options, stay in your seat quietly, or you can deplane. But Mr. Briggs is not moving." A smattering of applause rippled through the cabin, a chorus of silent approval. Charles felt humiliation rising in his throat, choking him. He wasn't supposed to be the one facing consequences. He wasn't supposed to be the villain. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash a torrent of righteous indignation, but before he could utter a word, Marcus reached into his inside pocket. He pulled out a slim leather wallet, flipped it open with a practiced flick of his wrist, and held it up for the entire cabin to see. And just like that, everything changed. A gold FBI badge gleamed under the sterile cabin lights, the stark reality shattering the carefully constructed facade of Charles's prejudice. The air in the plane seemed to thicken, the collective intake of breath a palpable wave of shock and disbelief. Passengers gasped, some chuckled nervously, and a few even clapped in stunned amusement. The young woman with the phone zoomed in, her eyes wide with triumph. Marcus's voice, calm and controlled, sliced through the stunned silence. "Sir?" he said smoothly, tilting his head slightly, his eyes boring into Charles's with unsettling intensity. "Would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Charles's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't speak. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. He simply waited, the badge a silent testament to Charles's monumental misjudgment. And for the first time, Charles felt truly trapped, the walls of his privileged world closing in around him. Charles wasn't just embarrassed. He was about to face the cold, hard reality of his actions. The silence in the cabin was thick and suffocating, stretching uncomfortably between Charles and Marcus. The gold emblem of the FBI badge reflected the overhead lights, a symbol of authority that carried the weight of the federal government. It was an image seared into the minds of everyone on board, a stark reminder of Charles's miscalculation. Passengers who had been whispering just moments ago were now staring openly, some smirking with undisguised schadenfreude, others wide-eyed with morbid fascination. Charles's mouth went dry, his brain desperately searching for an escape, an explanation, a way to rewind the clock. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. The man he had tried to bully off the plane, the man he had insinuated was a threat, was a federal law enforcement officer. His throat tightened, fear constricting his voice. Marcus's expression remained unreadable, betraying nothing of his thoughts or feelings. He simply sat there, the badge displayed prominently in his hand, his eyes locked onto Charles's, waiting. His voice, calm and level, cut through the tension like a laser. "Would you like to file an official complaint, sir?" The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Charles's body felt frozen, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He tried to speak, but all that escaped his lips was a faint, strangled, I. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You said you felt uncomfortable," he continued, his tone polite but edged with steel. "That's a serious allegation on a federal flight. If you believe I've done something inappropriate, I'd be happy to take your statement." Charles's stomach lurched, a wave of nausea washing over him. He could feel the shift in the cabin, the subtle change in the energy around him. Moments ago, he had controlled the narrative, fueled by his sense of entitlement and the silent acquiescence of those around him. Now, he was the one under scrutiny, the target of their collective judgment. A man 2 rows ahead let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, this is priceless," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The young woman with the phone zoomed in on Charles's face, capturing every nuance of his crumbling facade. Lauren, the flight attendant, stood nearby, her arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. But there was a subtle glint in her eyes, a flicker of satisfaction that she couldn't quite conceal. She was waiting, along with everyone else, to see how Charles would attempt to salvage the situation. Charles's breath came in short, shallow gasps. He couldn't admit that he had lied, couldn't confess that he had fabricated the entire incident simply to remove Marcus from his seat. But if he doubled down, if he persisted with his baseless accusations, he would be accusing a federal agent of posing a security risk on a flight, a charge that would carry serious consequences. His hands trembled in his lap, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. Marcus hadn't looked away, his gaze unwavering, his silence more damning than any accusation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles shook his head, the movement barely perceptible. "No," he croaked, his voice raspy and barely audible. "No complaint." Marcus nodded once as if he had anticipated Charles's capitulation all along. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the leather wallet, tucking it back into his jacket. He reopened his laptop, his fingers resuming their rhythmic dance across the keyboard. Just like that, it was over, at least for him. For Charles, the nightmare was just beginning. A few passengers murmured their approval and a couple even clapped softly, their faces alight with satisfaction. The businessman across the aisle smirked and returned to his newspaper, dismissing Charles as if he were a stain on the carpet. The young woman with the phone was already typing, her fingers flying across the screen, crafting a narrative that would soon be unleashed upon the digital world. Charles could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, threatening to burst from his chest. He wanted to shrink into his seat, to disappear, to rewind time and undo the last 10 minutes of his life. But there was no escaping the reality of the situation. He had embarrassed himself publicly, he had been exposed as a bigot, and worst of all, the entire incident had been recorded, destined to live forever in the digital ether. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for a sympathetic face, someone who might offer a gesture of understanding or support. But he found nothing but cold indifference, or worse, thinly veiled contempt. Even Lauren, the flight attendant who had initially treated him with such patience and courtesy, had lost the warmth in her expression, her face now etched with disapproval. Charles swallowed hard, his throat dry and scratchy. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to say something to regain control of the situation, but he knew, deep down, that there was nothing left to say. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, and somehow, he had already lost. Charles wasn't just humiliated, he was about to face the devastating consequences of his actions. Charles sat rigidly in his seat, staring straight ahead, his breathing shallow and erratic. His face burned with shame, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. This wasn't just a minor faux pas, a social misstep that could be excused with a well-placed apology. This was a public humiliation, a complete and utter destruction of his carefully cultivated image. Marcus, oblivious to the turmoil raging within Charles, had already moved on. He had flipped open his laptop again, his fingers tapping calmly on the keyboard, his focus unwavering. It was as if Charles didn't exist, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The rest of the cabin, however, had not forgotten. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Bluetooth smirked to himself, a glint of amusement in his eyes. The woman recording had stopped typing, but her phone was still angled slightly upward as if she was waiting for Charles to self-destruct. Even the flight attendants, who were supposed to remain neutral, seemed to regard him with a newfound air of suspicion. Lauren, the lead flight attendant, stood nearby, her gaze fixed on Charles as if anticipating his next outburst. Charles felt it all, the weight of their stares, the subtle judgment in their eyes, the palpable sense of condemnation hanging in the air. He had miscalculated badly. His fingers twitched nervously in his lap, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just some minor misunderstanding that he could smooth over with a forced laugh and a dismissive wave. He had tried to have an FBI agent removed from his seat, and the entire incident had been captured on video. The implications were settling in now, heavy and suffocating. His mouth was dry, his hands clammy, and a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. Lauren finally stepped closer, her tone still polite but devoid of warmth. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice low, "I need to confirm that you are okay to remain on this flight without further disruption." Charles stiffened, his muscles tensing. A handful of passengers glanced over, pretending not to eavesdrop, but hanging on every word. He wanted to snap, wanted to demand why he was being treated like the problem when all he had done was express his discomfort. But Marcus's badge had changed everything. He was trapped now, the power he thought he possessed suddenly stripped away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. He forced his lips into what he hoped was a calm expression, though his entire body trembled with barely suppressed rage. "I'm fine," he mumbled, the word laced with resentment. Lauren's gaze lingered for a moment, as if searching for any sign of deception. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm going to hold you to that then." She turned and walked away, leaving Charles to stew in his toxic brew of prejudice and regret. Charles exhaled shakily, clenching his hands together in his lap, fighting to maintain a semblance of composure. It was over, at least, that's what he desperately tried to believe. A sharp chime broke the tense silence. He looked up just as the young woman with the phone smirked at her screen and tapped twice, a subtle gesture of triumph that sent a jolt of fear through Charles's veins. He knew that look. He had seen it on his own grandchildren's faces when they shared something online, something meant to spread like wildfire. His fingers tightened around the armrest, his knuckles turning white. He turned slightly, his heart pounding against his ribs, and stole a glance at the woman's screen. Charles felt like he had been punched in the gut, the air knocked from his lungs. The caption was simple, but the implications were devastating. His hands went cold, his vision blurring at the edges. The flight wasn't even in the air yet, and somehow, he had already lost everything. And if the video was already online, that meant there was no stopping the inevitable fallout. He turned his head forward again, forcing himself to breathe, trying to convince himself that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe no one would care. Maybe it wouldn't spread. Maybe. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a jarring interruption that made him jump. Once. Twice. A third time. Charles's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to know the extent of the damage. But his hands moved on their own, reaching into his pocket, his fingers fumbling with the device. He pulled it out, and his stomach plummeted. Text messages flooded his screen, a relentless torrent of accusations and condemnations. Acquaintances, family members, people he hadn't heard from in years. Each one sent a variation of the same question, the same horrified disbelief. Charles, is this you? Just saw a video. Tell me this isn't real. Oh my God, Charles, what did you do? His heartbeat roared in his ears, drowning out the hum of the plane's engines. He swiped open his browser with trembling hands and tapped on Twitter, bracing himself for the inevitable onslaught. It took less than a second for the confirmation to hit him like a physical blow. His name was already trending, a beacon of shame illuminating his darkest prejudices for the entire world to see. The video had been uploaded less than 5 minutes ago, and yet it had already been viewed over 20,000 times. And the comments, they were a relentless barrage of condemnation, each one a stinging indictment of his character. Charles's vision blurred as he scrolled through the endless stream of vitriol, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Karma is real! This guy thought he could get away with it. Hope he enjoys the internet roasting he's about to get. The FBI part made my whole day. Instant karma. Expose his name. We need to know who this bigot is. Charles's breath hitched in his throat, his chest tightening with a suffocating wave of panic. His world wasn't just collapsing, it was burning, consumed by the inferno of public outrage. And for the first time, Charles realized that there was no coming back from this. This wasn't a mistake he could smooth over with a well-placed apology, a misunderstanding he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. This was a permanent stain on his reputation, a legacy of shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. But what happens after the flight lands is beyond Charles's worst fears. Charles gripped his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his fingers digging into the smooth metal casing. The cabin noise faded into the background, the murmur of conversations and the hum of the engines dissolving into a distant drone. All he could hear was the pounding of his pulse, the frantic rhythm of his fear. He could barely breathe, his chest constricted by a vice of anxiety. The video was still spreading, the view count ticking higher with each frantic refresh. 30,000 views. 42,000 views. 61,000 views. It wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating, a runaway train hurtling towards his destruction. He blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling for an escape, a way to stop this before it was too late. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back in. He swiped down, reading more comments, each one a dagger twisting in his gut. Imagine being this entitled. LOL. He thought he was going to get away with it. What a delusional old fool. The FBI part made my whole day. Instant karma. Expose his name. We need to know who this bigot is. His chest tightened, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. He glanced around the cabin as if searching for a way to rewind time, to erase the last hour from existence. But nobody was looking at him anymore. They didn't need to. They had already seen enough. He shifted in his seat, his whole body rigid with tension, his muscles coiled tight like a spring. Marcus, still beside him, hadn't moved, his fingers tapping lightly on his laptop keyboard. If he was aware of the viral firestorm consuming Charles, he didn't show it. He didn't care. And that, somehow, made it even worse. Charles's phone buzzed again, another notification vying for his attention. He flinched as if the sound itself was a physical assault. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the answer button, then pressed the decline button with a shaky finger. He wasn't ready for that conversation. He wasn't ready for any of this. The plane had barely even taken off, and yet his world was already collapsing around him. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm, to think rationally. He needed a plan, a way to fix this, to mitigate the damage. He could apologize, and issue a public statement expressing his remorse. Maybe that would help to quell the outrage. But no, that would only fuel the fire, giving the trolls and the haters even more ammunition to use against him. He could ignore it, pretend he hadn't seen the video, and hope that it would eventually fade away and be forgotten. But no, that was even worse. That would be seen as an admission of guilt, a tacit endorsement of the hateful views he had espoused. His mind raced, his thoughts colliding, spiraling out of control. He was drowning in a sea of despair, and there was no lifeguard in sight. Then, suddenly, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the fog of Charles's panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. The local time is 5:43 p.m. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare for landing." Charles's heart dropped like a stone. Landing. He had been so consumed by the digital inferno raging within the plane that he had completely forgotten about what was waiting for him outside of it. He refreshed the video one last time, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. 97,000 views. His name was trending. His life was over. He shoved his phone back into his pocket, the cold metal a stark reminder of the reality that awaited him. He tried to convince himself that he could still get ahead of this, that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be as bad as he thought. But deep down, he knew that he was lying to himself. The storm was coming, and there was no shelter to be found. Charles still hopes the storm will pass until he turns on the news. Charles practically bolted off the plane the second the doors opened, ignoring the side glances, the chuckles, and the unspoken judgment hanging in the air like a toxic fog. He just needed to get out, to escape the suffocating confines of the aircraft, and breathe some fresh air. But as he hurried through Reagan National Airport, his pulse skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. Waiting for him near baggage claim was a cluster of reporters, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of television lights. Not a huge crowd, not yet, but enough to make his blood run cold. A woman in a navy blazer held a microphone near her lips, reading from her phone as a cameraman filmed her every move. The now viral video shows an unidentified man attempting to have an FBI agent removed from first class, citing discomfort. The clip has gained over 1 million views in just a few hours, sparking outrage and condemnation across social media platforms. Charles stopped breathing, his feet rooted to the spot. 1 million views. That was impossible. The video had only been uploaded a few hours ago. How could it have spread so quickly, so virulently? He turned his head quickly, praying that they hadn't seen him, that he could somehow slip through the crowd unnoticed. But one of the reporters locked eyes with him, her face lighting up with predatory excitement. Wait! That's him! Charles spun on his heel, panic spiking in his chest, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He could not be seen like this, exposed and vulnerable, his reputation in tatters. He had to get out, to escape the scrutiny of the cameras and the relentless questions of the reporters. He moved fast, his expensive leather heels clicking sharply against the polished tile floor, the sound echoing through the terminal like a death knell. He needed to get to the exit, to find a taxi, to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But his phone buzzed violently in his pocket, a relentless barrage of texts, missed calls, and social media alerts. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape the digital firestorm that was consuming his life. He shoved past a group of travelers, muttering a half-hearted apology, his breath short and ragged, his hands clammy with sweat. He barely made it to the curb before his name was shouted behind him, the sound piercing the chaos of the airport like a siren's call. "Mr. Wentworth! Mr. Wentworth, do you have a response to the video?" He winced, his face contorting with a mixture of anger and despair. He hadn't even realized that his name had been released yet. How had they found him so quickly? How had they managed to connect him to the video? A taxi slowed near the curb, its yellow paint gleaming under the harsh streetlights. He nearly threw himself into the back seat, desperate to escape the prying eyes of the reporters. "Go!" he snapped at the driver, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Go now! Get me out of here!" The driver raised an eyebrow, startled by Charles's abruptness, but he pulled away from the curb without a word, leaving the reporters scrambling in their wake. Charles pressed his hands to his temples, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to block out the chaos and the shame that was swirling around him. 1 million views. His stomach churned with a mixture of nausea and fear. He had built his whole life on careful reputation management, cultivating a pristine image, on maintaining a veneer of respectability. And in a single afternoon, it was all gone, reduced to ashes by the viral flames of public outrage. His phone vibrated again, another notification vying for his attention. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize, an unfamiliar area code flashing on the screen. He stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He didn't want to answer it. He didn't want to hear the disappointment and condemnation in the voice on the other end of the line. But the phone continued to ring, a persistent and insistent reminder of the consequences of his actions. Finally, just before it went to voicemail, he swiped to answer, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" A brief silence hung in the air, thick with tension and unspoken judgment. Then, a clipped, professional voice spoke, each word measured and deliberate. "Mr. Wentworth, this is William Rollins, chair of the Marston Foundation. I assume you're aware of the situation?" Charles's mouth went dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. He had been on the Marston Foundation board for years, a prestigious charity that prided itself on its progressive image, its commitment to inclusivity, and its unwavering ethical leadership. And he already knew what this call was about. The axe was about to fall, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "William, we're going to need you to step down." Rollins interrupted immediately, his voice cold and unforgiving. Charles stared blankly ahead, his mind reeling, his body numb with shock. It wasn't a request. It was an order, a non-negotiable demand. His pulse drummed in his ears, his vision blurring at the edges. "But this is being taken out of context. There's more to the story than what's shown in the video." "The board disagrees," Rollins replied, his voice flat and final. "We'll issue a public statement by morning, condemning your actions and reaffirming our commitment to diversity and inclusion. We expect your resignation by then." A sharp beat filled the air. Rollins had hung up, severing the connection with ruthless efficiency. Charles lowered the phone slowly, his hand trembling uncontrollably. His career was over. His reputation was gone. His carefully constructed world had been reduced to ashes. And the worst part was that no one cared about his explanation. No one wanted to hear his side of the story. They had seen the video, and the video was enough. It was a damning indictment of his character, a permanent stain on his legacy. He let out a shaky breath, his body slumped with defeat. This wasn't something he could control. This wasn't something he could spin. This was something he had done to himself, a consequence of his prejudice and entitlement. And now, he had to live with it. Meanwhile, Marcus Briggs hadn't even spared him another thought. By now, he was probably in a meeting, conducting FBI business, completely unbothered by the chaos he had left in his wake. His life was untouched, his reputation untarnished, because for him, this had been just another Tuesday, another encounter with the ugly face of prejudice. If this story made you think, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life scenarios.